Our next speaker is considered the father of American homeschooling, and I'm still looking for one of his books out of print, which is called Is Public Education Really Necessary? And yeah, it goes back to basically a shift that happened at Harvard University when they shift from Calvinism, which is we basically always constantly have to turn to the Lord, to a more Unitarian thing, which no, we're humanists, we can do things on our own, we can solve everything through just education and so forth. So here to speak about his new book, Revolution, and that's Red Revolution via Education, is John Birch's very own Sam Blumenfeld. Sam.
Well, it's a delight as usual to be among Birchers. At least you understand what's going on in the world. I was very impressed with what Brad had to say because as a collector of antiquarian books, I often come across old almanacs that have lots of ads for businesses. Those were the days when the government was not involved in American business, and you had a company for everything. It was amazing what Americans were able to do under total economic freedom. And incidentally, private property is so important in this country that one of the reasons why we have a patent office is to protect the private property of inventors. And recently I came across a gazette put out by the patent office, over 1,000 pages, a huge book. And in it were the patents that had been granted by the patent office for 3 months, a period of 3 months in the 1870s. Now, that's an amazing, amazing production for the American people. That's why we have the economy that we have, even though now it's being throttled. But it was created by all these inventors who then made new things that had to be manufactured, that had to be financed, that had to be sold, and they created the greatest economy in the history of the human race, you see. So I understand exactly what Brad is saying, how that whole system has been virtually destroyed. And he described to us what he has to go through as an owner of a small business. So just multiply that across the nation and you can see what's happening to the United States. And how can you turn that around? It's going to be very difficult because most of the people in this country are, I would say, addicted to government help, government ownership, government regulation. And I don't know how you break that addiction. Maybe we have to go through some really severe times before that can turn around. But in any case, I do want to say something about my books. As you all know, I've been writing about education, for the last 40 years. I created Alpha Phonics, which many of you have used to teach your own children and your grandchildren to read. It's the only, and of course I've been a pioneer in the homeschool movement, and incidentally, it was Birchers who were the earliest of the homeschoolers. Why? Because they understood immediately what government education was doing, and they were brave enough to take their kids out of the public schools and to create this homeschool movement, which has now really grown into a sizable enterprise. And all you have to do is attend a homeschool convention in any state. And here in Massachusetts, for example, where you know how liberal this state is, believe it or not, we have a superb Christian homeschool organization. And I remember the first convention they had back in the 1980s. It was in a church basement. 300 people showed up. And this last convention was in the Worcester Convention Center with 3,000 parents showing up. So that's a phenomenon that I think the socialists are going to have a good deal of problems trying to dismantle, because socialism and homeschooling are totally incompatible. They cannot live together in the same system. So one has got to go. You know, as Oscar Wilde said when he was dying in this particular room, he looked at the wallpaper and he said, "One of us has got to go." And it's the same thing here in the United States. Either socialism goes or homeschooling goes, and homeschoolers are not about to let that happen. These are very brave people who are going to stand up to whatever pressures are going to be put on them. Anyway, my latest book is entitled Revolution in Education, via Education. And in that book, I showed how all of this was deliberately done by the professors at the turn of the last century. They set out a plan to socialize America because they were socialists. John Dewey was an avowed socialist. And he got his socialism not so much from Karl Marx as from Edward Bellamy, who had written a book entitled Looking Backward, in which he predicted a socialist America in the year 2000. And that's where he got his idea of equality. You know, the Chinese had socialism really down pat. They all dressed alike. You remember the days before their switch over to capitalism? Everybody dressed in the same Mao suit. Well, that's what socialists want, you know. And of course, they're not going to be able to get it here in the United States where we're so fashion conscious. But nevertheless, that's what they want, equality. If they can't have equality of dress, they'll want equality of income. We'll all be equally poor. You see, that's what they mean by equality, you know, redistribution of the wealth. Because whatever wealth is going to be distributed, that's it. There will be no more wealth created because socialists don't know how to create wealth. They only know how to take wealth from others, you see. And that's what we're having now. And one of the reasons why socialists now run this country from the White House is because they've controlled American education for the last 50 or 60 years, and they've been indoctrinating the youngsters so that they don't know the difference between socialism and capitalism. They don't know the difference between a constitutional republic and a social democracy, or communism, or a communist state. They just don't know it, you see. That's why so many of them admire Fidel Castro or Che Guevara. These are Americans who they don't know the difference. And so they voted in a socialist regime in Washington, which is doing everything in its power as quickly as possible to change this nation from a capitalist, individualistic nation into a collectivist socialist nation. And they're working so fast at it and so furiously at it that they, of course, have stimulated an opposition. You see, John Dewey was very clever. He and his socialists said, we've got to do this very gradually, because if we do it too quickly, the people will wake up and they'll rise up against us. So they know whatever they were doing, the American people didn't want. But they realized that the only way they could deceive us into accepting socialism is to do it in very gradual steps. But now that they're in the White House and in Congress, they don't have to wait anymore, you see. So they're accelerating everything, and this acceleration is now causing the Tea Parties and the grassroots rebellion that you see in the country. And I don't know if you watch Glenn Beck on Fox News, you could see what's happening in this country, something that has never happened before. People are beginning to wake up. Because, you know, I've been involved with the Birch Society since, I suppose it was about 1960s.
It was 18th.
Jack has it right. But anyway, you know, I knew Robert Welch and all those wonderful stalwart individuals who created this magnificent society. And in those days, we were fighting communism. And we had men dying in Vietnam. We had men dying fighting communism in North Korea. We had them fighting communism in Vietnam. We had them fighting communism in Grenada. We had them fighting communism all over the world. Americans were dying fighting communism. And what do we have today? The communists are now in the White House. The communists are here, trying to rule us. What happened to all the work we did? Well, as adults, we put up a pretty good fight. The problem is that they control education. Yeah. They control the schools. And they were able to manipulate and indoctrinate the children of America so that they would vote the communists in, regardless of how many Americans have died fighting communism. So the communists are in, and we face this huge battle. But anyway, I wanted Americans to know how all of this had started. It didn't happen overnight. These communist educators have been working at it since the 1890s. And they knew what they were doing. They had to dumb down the people. Why do you think we have an illiterate society? It's because they have dumbed them down. They changed the way reading was taught in American schools, and this was all planned. John Dewey said it in 1898. He said, we've got to change the way children are taught in the primary schools. You have to destroy their ability to become independently intelligent. You have to destroy their ability to read the written word. And they've done a magnificent job, because now we have a legislation about dyslexia and reading disabilities and all kinds of problems, ADD. You all have heard of ADD. I'm sure you all have a young relative who has ADD or ADHD, and it's all caused by the schools. You know that there are over 4 million, probably 6 million children now taking pills, taking Ritalin in schools. Can you imagine going to school and having to take a medication? When I was going to school back in the 1930s, which is ancient history, of course, there was no dyslexia. Everybody learned to read. There was no such thing as Ritalin. As a matter of fact, when I was in China a couple of years ago, I was invited by an entrepreneur who wanted to use my teaching method in China to teach the Chinese to read English. I visited a Chinese school. It was a large school, and I was on the second floor with a window facing the schoolyard, in which all of these kids were doing their exercises. And I asked the principal, I said, how many of these kids are on Ritalin? And he said, what's Ritalin? I feel that pretty soon they will know what Ritalin is about, because they're accepting everything America does, Whatever America does is wonderful. It's very fine. But anyway, we have an incredible job on our hands, and you are in the forefront. You are the shock troops for capitalism. And so you have to be very well prepared, and that's why I want you to buy my book. Publishing is still the one area where there is, I would say, the maximum freedom because of the First Amendment. Businesses like Brad's have to do so many things, are so horribly restricted. It's awfully difficult to do business. Of course, they hire people. But today in America, as an individual, you can now self-publish, or you can have a small company that publish books. But of course, we want them to be read. So I hope that you will get my new book. I don't have any copies with me, but I have the brochure, and you can order them, and I think you will enjoy it. I also want to mention my book on Shakespeare, I believe that the works of Shakespeare were written by Christopher Marlowe.
Sam, can you mention both titles for the camera for the people
Oh,
that might be watching on
okay.
YouTube?
This book is the Marlowe-Shakespeare Connection. You see, there's been a controversy over whether or not William Shakespeare wrote the works attributed to him, and that's because there's nothing in his biography that indicates that he was a writer. Actually, he was a front for someone who had to write anonymously, and that person was Christopher Marlowe, who had already written many great plays. I'm sure you're familiar with some of them: Tamerlane, Dr. Faustus, Edward II. And I'm sure you're all familiar with that wonderful line from Dr. Faustus when Faustus asks Mephistopheles to bring Helen of Troy to him. He wants to see Helen of Troy. And so Mephistopheles, being a good chap, brings him Helen. There she is, and he looks at her and he says, "Is this the face that launched a thousand?" You see, he knows it even better than I do. "Launched 1,000 ships and burnt the towers of Ilium." That's Christopher Marlowe. Anyway, he had to hide his authorship because he was indicted for all sorts of reasons, atheism, blasphemy, and all sorts of trumped up charges. And he was saved by his boss, Burleigh, Lord Burleigh, who was Queen Elizabeth's right-hand man. And they said the only way to save you from the gallows is to fake your death. When we fake your death, send you into exile, the case will be closed, you see. And that's what happened, but he kept on writing. And he wrote all of these magnificent plays that are in the first folio, the 36 plays in the first folio. The interesting thing about that whole Elizabethan era is that the Puritans were persecuted under Elizabeth. Why? Because they rejected the Anglican Church, which they felt was too much like the Catholic Church. They said, if we're going to go back to simplicity, we must do what Calvin would like us to do, and that is to have the congregational type of church. And as you know, that's the church that started here in Massachusetts, in New England. The Puritans left England and came to these shores so that they could practice their religion in a very simple way. And as you know, a congregational church is a very simple liturgy and also very democratic, because it's the parishioners who elect the minister. There's no archbishop, no bishops, no fancy dress, just very simple church. And that's, so you can see the connection between what was going on in Elizabeth's England and what happened here in the United States. In any case, I strongly urge you to purchase both books. Thank you.